Operation Mincemeat ended the way an invasion is never supposed to end, before the first landing craft even moved. April 1943. British intelligence pushed a dead body into the currents off Spain, dressed as a Royal Marines officer, carrying secret plans that pointed Germany away from Sicily. The Germans took the documents. They rebalanced forces. Sicily became less protected. The Allied assault gained room to breathe. And the disturbing part is not that the lie worked. It's why it worked. Why did one of the most suspicious intelligence systems in Europe accept papers pulled from a corpse? Why did bureaucracy and professional pride become stronger than strategic instinct? And what does it mean when a war can be shifted by a story engineered to survive scrutiny? This episode is not about how Operation Mincemeat was executed. That story is already familiar, and on its own, it explains very little. The real strategic problem sits elsewhere. In early 1943, the British command faced a dilemma that could not be solved by firepower alone. Sicily was the obvious target. Too obvious. German planners knew it. Italian defenses expected it. Any conventional invasion plan would collide head-on with prepared resistance, political pressure, and limited Allied capacity to absorb catastrophic losses. The problem was not choosing where to land. The problem was how to make the enemy stop believing what was logically true. This is why mincemeat matters. Not as a clever trick, but as a strategic intervention into the enemy's decision-making system. The British were not trying to hide Sicily. They were trying to make Germany commit mentally to a different reality, one that would feel safer, more reasonable, and more consistent with German intelligence doctrine than the truth itself. That is what makes this strategy fundamentally unorthodox. It did not aim to reduce uncertainty. It aimed to weaponize certainty. And that raises the central question of this documentary. How does a military system built to detect deception end up amplifying it instead? What assumptions inside German intelligence made this lie not only believable, but compelling? And why did British planners accept a plan where failure would not mean delay or losses, but total strategic exposure? To answer that, we need to step away from the corpse and the documents, and look at the pressure, constraints, and blind spots that shaped every decision leading up to this gamble. Because the moment you understand the strategic box both sides were trapped in, you begin to see why an idea this dangerous was even considered. By early 1943, the war in Europe had reached an unstable equilibrium. Germany was overstretched but still dangerous. Britain and the United States had momentum, but not freedom. Every major move now carried political, logistical, and psychological consequences beyond the battlefield. The Mediterranean was not just a theater of operations. It was a corridor. Whoever controlled it shaped supply routes, alliance cohesion, and the pace of the war itself. Sicily sat at the center of that corridor. Geographically, it was the obvious next step after North Africa. Strategically, it was a trap. German command understood its value. Italian leadership feared it. Any serious planner on both sides could see the logic pointing towards Sicily. That was precisely the problem. When a target becomes obvious, preparation follows. Defenses harden. Reaction plans are written in advance. Surprise evaporates long before the first shot is fired. The Allies faced constraints that rarely appear on maps. Amphibious capacity was limited. Air cover could not be everywhere at once. Political patience in London and Washington was finite, especially after costly campaigns that produced ambiguous gains. A failed landing would not just mean losses on the beach. It would mean delay, loss of credibility, and a strategic pause Germany could exploit. There was no margin for a frontal gamble. Germany, meanwhile, operated under a different set of pressures. Its intelligence system was large, methodical, and deeply suspicious. It had learned to expect deception everywhere. But it was also rigid. Information moved upward through layers that rewarded consistency, not imagination. Once an assessment aligned with doctrine and prior expectations, it gained momentum. Doubt became harder to introduce the higher it traveled. This created a paradox. The Germans were actively looking for Allied deception, but only within the boundaries of what they believed the Allies were capable of doing. They expected tricks, but not irrational ones. They expected misdirection, but only if it followed strategic logic as they defined it. Anything that appeared too absurd risked being dismissed. Anything that appeared too reasonable risked being believed. That was the pressure point. The British were not trying to hide an invasion. They were trying to redirect certainty. They needed Germany to become confident in the wrong answer, not merely uncertain about the right one. And that required a move that fit German expectations better than reality itself. It is at this intersection of constraint, predictability, and institutional confidence that a strategy most commanders would reject began to look viable. Any conventional military handbook would have offered a narrow set of options. Secure air superiority. Concentrate naval power. Mask the landing zone with limited feints. Accept losses as the price of forcing a breach. This was how amphibious warfare was supposed to work in 1943, and most senior commanders were trained to think within that frame. The assumption underneath it was simple: the enemy might be deceived about timing or scale, but not about intent. If Sicily was the strategic key, then Sicily would be attacked, and Germany would prepare accordingly. Following that logic led to a dead end. Feints were no longer enough because Germany had learned to discount them. Partial deception created suspicion, not confusion. Even if German command remained uncertain about the exact landing point, it could still hold reserves centrally and respond after the fact. That meant the Allies would pay the price in blood on the beaches, precisely when they could least afford it. In other words, the textbook approach did not fail tactically. It failed structurally. It could not generate the kind of decisive asymmetry the situation demanded. The deeper problem was predictability. Every reasonable plan converged toward the same outcome because both sides shared the same strategic grammar. German planners did not need perfect intelligence. They only needed to understand Allied logic. As long as the Allies acted within that logic, Germany could react fast enough to blunt the impact. Surprise, in the meaningful sense, was already gone. This is where the contradiction sharpened. If the Allies followed doctrine, they would collide with prepared defenses. If they tried to conceal doctrine, Germany would assume deception and hedge. The system rewarded caution, not creativity. That meant any plan that felt safe was already compromised. The only remaining option was to step outside the shared logic entirely, to do something that did not just mislead the enemy about details, but disrupted how conclusions were reached in the first place. That is why Operation Mincemeat could exist at all. Not because British intelligence was unusually bold, but because conventional strategy had exhausted its usefulness. The choice was no longer between a good plan and a risky one. It was between a risky plan and a predictable failure. And once that realization set in, the question stopped being whether such a plan was absurd, and became whether absurdity itself could be weaponized. Operation Mincemeat did not emerge from confidence. It emerged from discomfort. Inside British planning circles, the idea surfaced gradually, and it was never universally embraced. This was not a bold commander imposing vision from the top. It was a fragile concept moving sideways through an intelligence system that understood exactly how easily it could collapse. The objections were immediate and rational. A deception this extreme violated professional instinct. It relied on human behavior that could not be modeled or controlled. It asked planners to trust that the enemy would think in a very specific way, at a very specific moment, under pressures they could only infer. What made the idea survive was not enthusiasm, but alignment. The people involved shared a single realization: conventional alternatives were worse. The proposal did not promise success. It promised a different kind of risk, one that shifted exposure away from the battlefield and into the cognitive space of the enemy. That distinction mattered. A failed landing would be visible, measurable, and politically explosive. A failed deception might never be fully understood, even by those who launched it. That asymmetry made the gamble survivable inside the system. At the core of the decision sat a small number of assumptions. First, that German intelligence trusted documents more than patterns. Second, that bureaucratic validation mattered more than individual doubt. Third, that once a narrative passed through enough procedural filters, it would harden into truth. None of these assumptions were guaranteed. All of them were debatable. But together, they pointed toward a narrow window where the absurd could become persuasive. The real strategic move was not the fake plans themselves. It was the decision to attack the enemy's method of reasoning rather than their information gap. Mincemeat was designed to exploit how intelligence assessments are built, endorsed, and defended. It aimed at the seams between analysts, officers, and commanders, where responsibility diffuses and confidence grows. If the story could survive those seams, it would no longer need protection. It would protect itself. This is why opposition never fully disappeared. Skeptics understood that the plan had no halfway outcome. Either Germany would commit resources away from Sicily, or the deception would fail so completely that it might strengthen German confidence in their own counterintelligence. There was no gradual escalation. The decision demanded total commitment to a hypothesis about the enemy's mind. And once that commitment was made, retreat was no longer an option. From that point forward, success depended not on British control, but on German interpretation. Turning mincemeat from an idea into an operational mechanism was where the strategy almost collapsed under its own weight. On paper, the logic was clean. In practice, every step introduced variables that could not be controlled, only managed. The operation required the coordination of intelligence officers, naval procedures, medical plausibility, diplomatic ambiguity, and timing precise enough to intersect with German attention cycles. None of these elements were designed for deception. Each had to be bent without breaking. The central problem was not planting false documents. It was ensuring those documents would be discovered, handled, authenticated, and forwarded exactly as expected. Too fast, and suspicion followed. Too slow, and the information lost relevance. The body itself had to tell a story consistent with accidental death, not deliberate placement. The paperwork had to look important, but not staged. Every detail existed in tension, realistic enough to pass inspection, imperfect enough to feel genuine. This was not craftsmanship. It was behavioral engineering under uncertainty. Risk accumulated silently. Spain's ambiguous neutrality introduced diplomatic exposure. Local authorities could mishandle the body. German agents might bypass normal channels. A single forensic anomaly could trigger deeper scrutiny. Worse, success depended on the Germans doing what the British could not control, believing the documents, sharing them internally, and acting without second-guessing. Once the body entered the system, British agency effectively ended. From that point on, the plan lived or died inside German procedures. There were moments when the operation hovered near failure. Delays. Unclear signals. Periods of waiting where nothing could be adjusted or corrected. Unlike a military assault, there was no feedback loop. No reconnaissance update. No course correction. Silence was the only indicator, and silence could mean success or disaster. This was the psychological cost of the strategy. Those involved had to accept powerlessness as part of execution. What sustained the plan was coherence. Every element pointed in the same direction. There were no contradictions for German intelligence to exploit, no alternative narratives competing for attention. The deception did not demand belief through persuasion. It demanded acceptance through process. If the system behaved as designed, the story would move forward on its own momentum. And once that momentum reached the German command structure, the final test would no longer be about truth or falsity, but about how decisions are made under institutional confidence. German reaction to the information did not begin with excitement. It began with procedure. The documents moved through channels designed to prevent precisely this kind of manipulation. Verification followed protocol. Cross-checks were applied where they were expected to matter. And that is exactly where the strategy found traction. The material did not demand belief. It invited confirmation. Each step reinforced the next because nothing appeared out of place inside the system's own logic. The key failure was not credulity. It was alignment. The information fit too well with existing German assumptions about Allied behavior. It pointed toward targets Germany already believed were vulnerable. It explained Allied movements that had seemed ambiguous. Most importantly, it reduced uncertainty. Faced with complex signals across the Mediterranean, the documents offered clarity. In intelligence work, clarity is seductive. Once a narrative reduces cognitive load, it gains authority. At the operational level, this clarity hardened quickly. Analysts framed assessments that matched doctrine. Commanders saw no reason to challenge conclusions that felt strategically sound. Dissent carried risk, while agreement carried safety. The system did what it was built to do. It filtered, validated, and escalated information that conformed to expectation. By the time doubts could have mattered, decisions were already in motion. The real error was structural. German command believed that anticipating deception meant anticipating the enemy's most rational lie. They did not consider that the lie itself could be designed to survive scrutiny by exploiting bureaucratic incentives. Once forces were repositioned and defenses adjusted, reversing course would have meant admitting a systemic failure. At that stage, commitment outweighed caution. This is the decisive moment of mincemeat. The success did not come from British brilliance alone, nor from German incompetence. It came from the interaction between a deception engineered for process and a command structure optimized for consistency. The lie did not defeat intelligence. It used intelligence to propagate itself. And once that propagation reached the level of irreversible deployment, the outcome of the campaign was no longer determined on the beaches of Sicily, but in offices where certainty had already replaced doubt. The immediate outcome was measurable. German forces were repositioned. Defensive priorities shifted. Sicily was not left undefended, but it was no longer the center of gravity German planners had prepared for. When the Allied landings came, resistance was real, but fragmented. Time was gained. Losses were reduced. Momentum held. From a purely operational perspective, mincemeat achieved what it was designed to do. But stopping the analysis, there would be a mistake. The deeper cost of the strategy was not paid on the battlefield. It was paid in precedent. Mincemeat demonstrated that a human life could be reduced to a delivery mechanism for strategic effect. The individual at the center of the operation had no agency, no consent, and no voice in how his death would be used. That moral compromise was never debated in public, because the results made debate unnecessary. Success closed the conversation before it could begin. There was also a strategic cost hidden in the victory. By proving that deception could replace force at scale, the operation encouraged a belief that future conflicts could be managed through manipulation rather than confrontation. That belief is dangerous. Deception works best when it is rare. The more it becomes doctrine, the more systems adapt to resist it. Mincemeat could not be repeated indefinitely without diminishing returns. Its success carried the seed of its own obsolescence. For the decision-makers involved, the psychological burden was real. They had committed to a plan that offered no partial success and no honorable failure. Had the deception collapsed, the invasion would have proceeded under worse conditions than before, and responsibility would have been difficult to diffuse. The fact that it worked did not erase that weight. It merely buried it under outcome. And finally, there is the counterfactual that cannot be ignored. If a single assumption had failed, if German intelligence had paused instead of committing, if internal skepticism had reached the wrong desk at the right moment, the strategy would not have unraveled gradually. It would have failed completely. No contingency could recover it. That is the price of strategies built on narrative dominance rather than material control. They deliver leverage quickly, but they collapse instantly when belief breaks. Operation Mincemeat is often remembered as a triumph of cleverness. That framing is comforting, and it is incomplete. At its core, this was not a story about outsmarting the enemy with ingenuity. It was a case study in how modern warfare can be shaped by controlling the process through which decisions are justified, rather than the battlefield on which they are executed. The British did not defeat German intelligence by hiding information. They defeated it by feeding the system something it wanted to believe, in a form it was designed to trust. The first principle this exposes is that intelligence systems do not primarily seek truth. They seek coherence. Information that aligns with doctrine, reduces ambiguity, and reinforces existing assessments moves faster and encounters less resistance. Mincemeat exploited that bias with precision. The deception succeeded not because it was invisible, but because it was legible. It made sense within the enemy's worldview. That is why it passed scrutiny. Not despite scrutiny. The second principle is more uncomfortable. High-risk unorthodox strategies emerge not from brilliance, but from exhaustion. Mincemeat was born when conventional options no longer produced advantage. It was not a preference. It was a last coherent alternative. That matters, because it reframes the operation from a model to be copied into a warning about the conditions that produce such gambles. When systems stop offering viable orthodox paths, leaders begin to accept risks they would normally reject. The third principle concerns cost. Strategies that rely on narrative dominance carry asymmetric consequences. When they succeed, they appear elegant and bloodless. When they fail catastrophically and without mitigation. There is no gradual degradation. Belief either holds or collapses. This makes such strategies seductive and dangerous in equal measure. They reward confidence, punish doubt, and leave little room for correction. Finally, mincemeat forces a reassessment of what winning means in war. The operation did not destroy enemy forces directly. It altered how those forces were positioned, justified, and committed. Victory came from shaping interpretation rather than imposing force. That approach did not eliminate violence. It redistributed it. And in doing so, it raised ethical questions that remain unresolved, precisely because the outcome made them inconvenient to confront. This is why Operation Mincemeat resists easy classification. It was not a trick, not a doctrine, and not a template. It was a moment where strategic pressure, institutional rigidity, and human psychology intersected in a way that produced leverage. Understanding it requires abandoning the comfort of hindsight and accepting that, at the time, it was a gamble that could not be proven rational until it was already irreversible. And that is the quiet danger of unorthodox strategy. When it works, it convinces future planners that belief can substitute for control, long after the conditions that made it possible have disappeared. Operation Mincemeat did not win the war. It did something more subtle and, in some ways, more unsettling. It proved that under the right conditions, belief can be engineered to move armies before a single order is questioned. The British did not control German forces. They controlled the reasoning that justified where those forces should be sent. That distinction matters, because it marks a shift from war as a contest of strength to war as a contest of interpretation. The operation also exposes a limit that is easy to ignore in hindsight. Mincemeat worked because it was rare, because it aligned perfectly with enemy expectations, and because the system it targeted was confident in its own rigor. Remove any one of those conditions, and the strategy collapses. This was not a universal method. It was a moment-specific exploitation of rigidity. Treating it as a timeless lesson is the fastest way to misunderstand it. There is one final discomfort that history tends to smooth over. The success of Mincemeat closed the space for moral accounting. The dead men at the center of the operation remained a footnote, because the outcome made the question inconvenient. Strategic effectiveness erased ethical debate. That pattern repeats throughout modern warfare, whenever results are allowed to substitute for reflection. This is why unorthodox strategies demand restraint, not celebration. They expand what is possible, but they also narrow what feels unacceptable. When belief becomes a weapon, the line between insight and manipulation thins quickly. Mincemeat sits on that line. Not as a model to copy, but as a case to study carefully, and reluctantly. In future campaigns, the battlefield will matter less than the systems that interpret it. The decisive fight will not always be over territory, but over which version of reality gains institutional traction first. Operation Mincemeat was not the beginning of that kind of war. But it was one of the